So our next presentation is by Amber Matthews, and they'll be discussing diversity is not the answer towards anti-racist praxis in LIS.
Thanks, Cora. So I hope my audio is okay. I have 4 sets of headphones, and about 10 minutes ago, 2 stopped working. So I'm just going to go ahead here and start. So again, as the abstract suggests, my goal today is to outline the theoretical foundations of my doctoral project to examine systemic racism in library and information science. I know some, like Pam, have probably heard some of this talk before, but before I get started, I think it's first to be important to be explicit about my relationship to the topic and the community. It does not elude me that I am here as a white woman to speak about race in our already overwhelmingly white field. My hope is to present an approach to situating racism and anti-racism in librarianship as a partnership with communities affected rather than another oppressive act. I'd also like to start by quickly framing how it is that I developed a passion for this research. So I came to librarianship after almost a 10-year career in community development. In various roles, I was offered, I saw that there were, profound differences between the opportunities afforded across race and cultures. It appeared to me when I arrived in librarianship that there was a strange relationship to social oppression. One that seemed where we posited that information in libraries were unaffected by race, and the correlation then was that we were immune to social structures like systemic and institutional racism. As a then outsider, I found this to be a very confusing and paradoxical perspective. It appeared to me that race existed outside of our spaces and gave relevance to our social justice frameworks. It entered our discourse when we aimed to position ourselves and our work as essential, yet we rarely spoke about how race influences decisions that we make in our work, what we study, or the effects of those decisions on others. And I also noticed very early that there were profound gaps in our scholarship on culturally relevant information and needs. We know even less about what social and cultural inclusion might look like in practice. And so although race is a biologically baseless signifier of difference, we also know very well that racism is real. We also know that the work of libraries affects people and groups differently. And in recent months, we have all witnessed shocking acts of police violence, with rising attention on systemic racism as a deeply embedded and invisible form of marginalization. And we have begun to see that meaningful responses to structural problems must necessarily also be structural. Thus, the spirit of my paper today is to trouble our present responses and argue that we have important work to do before we can claim that we are inclusive or anti-racist fully. And through various mediums, I challenge library scholars and practitioners to examine how racism has been embedded through the unexamined culture of whiteness in our spaces and practices. And in doing so, I believe that we can make meaningful progress to address social structures, practices, and discourses that support structural and institutional racism in and outside of our field. As many of us know, in librarianship, institutional responses center around diversity and inclusivity narratives. However, these perspectives overlook how racial, economic, and cultural marginalization resist social inclusion and further entrench the deeply ingrained institutionalization of racism. The work of this paper is to theorize points of analytic departure that intersect and enter into dialogue with anti-racist and critical diversity discourses to inform trajectories of new scholarship. Drawing in particular on the work of Ibram X. Kendi, the final section presents a pragmatic and agentic argument for the LIS community to recast its work within an anti-racist framework. To that end, many of us have been grappling with what does it actually mean to be anti-racist. So perhaps it's wise to be clear about what it is not. Anti-racism is not an aspirational goal or institutional buzzword. It's not another policy or committee. It's not a statement to demonstrate that we recognize inequity and extend support to those affected. It is not a book list or a hashtag to show solidarity. Although it has been used in such ways, anti-racism is fundamentally a practice of decentering white supremacy and rebuilding equitable relationships to end racial injustice. It is a conscious shift to hold ourselves and our institutions accountable for addressing the connections between historical ways of doing our work and the resulting systemic inequity. In other words, we cannot declare that we are simply diverse or anti-racist. There's a profound difference between performing and being anti-racist, which is to say that you cannot perform anti-racism. We must actually be anti-racist. And to be anti-racist, we must critically look at our role in supporting injustice and inequity. My work is heavily inspired by critical theorists such as Eve Tuck, an Indigenous and Education Studies at OISE, anti-racism scholar and educator George Day, also at OISE, Kathy Kamasi in Library and Information Science at Wayne State University, and Kendi, the founding director of the Center for Anti-Racist Research at Boston University. Individually, these scholars call on the beholders of community power and responsibility to reframe our discussion, to consider the lived experience of others, what counts as knowledge, and who matters. Thus, fundamentally, my work is an epistemological challenge to develop tools to effectively analyze our values and our history, to meaningfully contest the impacts of racism in librarianship. This begins by problematizing notions of neutrality, colorblindness, and diversity, to show how they are harmful, inequitable, and sometimes racist. While not explicitly or purposefully racist, I argue that failing to address the dominance of whiteness, redressing racial justice, and acknowledging the force of race is in fact a powerful act of racism itself. It is one that privileges the cultural dominance of whiteness and whose unspoken insinuation is that others lack knowledge and cultural capital by virtue of being non-white. As we explore this topic, it's important to have a shared understanding of the terms and concepts used. Racialized refers to those who do not possess societal privileges associated with the dominant white identity and intersects with forms of socioeconomic, cultural, and social marginalization. Terms like racialization and racialized are signifiers of a process and the result. Race itself is the embodiment of the structure of privilege. Thus, racialized aims to convey systemic processes of inequity that result in degrees of varying social, cultural, and economic opportunities that are both embodied and experienced. However, racialized groups cannot be conceived as a homogenized entity, and they do not have a unified experience or speak from a single voice. Rather, its usage in my work signifies similar experiences of marginalization and acknowledges the negotiation of identity in concert with social factors like race, class, gender, and migration. Still, it's also important to note that the usage of the term racialized is not wholly unproblematic. It can apply a general assumption of disadvantage in racialized groups and is one-dimensional. My usage in particular aims to focus on the relationships of power and privilege, tacit and institutional responses. Like race, racism isn't easy or simple to define. Its multi-forms span from holding expressly racist personal opinions to widespread instances of structural racism that manifests in social institutions like schools and libraries. While ubiquitous, racism is a serious allegation with serious consequences. This is no more true than today in our cancel culture, where there is a real and understandable reluctance to acknowledge when we have acted or thought in a way that may be construed as racist. However, the point remains that we can never address a problem that we deny exists. This means being explicitly clear that systemic racism directly affects libraries and library interactions. But this is rarely an intentional decision or action. Oh my gosh, sorry. Rather, as this definition from the Government of Ontario suggests, it is a result of hidden institutional biases that privilege or disadvantage people based on race and is sustained by organizational perspectives around doing things the way they've always been done without considering how they impact particular groups differently. Thus, while provocative and jarring, I suggest that racism must be recognized as endemic to LIS. While the idea of librarianship posits equity, colorblindness, and neutrality, the librarian practice has a shaded past through deeply violent, racist, and disturbing times. In no uncertain terms, libraries have been actors in inherently racist projects where their work served to support and ingrain socially constructed ideas of race and class. For example, historical accounts and memoirs of library founders reveal their motivations were not as benevolent or altruistic as contemporary narratives suggest. Yet in recent literature, there is limited attention paid to how libraries were key to the formation of the burgeoning white middle class or the gendered nature of this work. In fact, critical library theorist Todd Honma notes that in contemporary idealized visions of benevolence, the role of the library in social development and control is ignored entirely. Rather, as if they emerge and are external to their socio-historical context. Thus, while many proffer that libraries are both neutral and diverse, The historical and contemporary prevalence of whiteness renders library spaces and practices neither racially neutral nor objective. Libraries are a racial space where the dominance of whiteness is sustained through norms, values, and structures that operationalize white ways of being and knowing as invisible. Ingrained notions of race neutrality mask the dominance of whiteness and shield those with institutional power from identifying how they perpetuate and benefit from racial inequality. The reticence to acknowledge this facet of librarianship stems from our strong attachment to objectivity, neutrality, and diversity as the bedrock of our field and practices. These serve to support the philosophical fallacy that libraries reside in an ahistorical and an acultural context that is immune from perpetuating racial oppression. Libraries do not exist in a race-blind world, and the social realities facing racialized users are rarely lessened through principles like diversity and inclusivity alone. In fact, these perpetuate racial injustice and are more akin to opening our space for others rather than addressing the problems in organizational and professional practices. Eve Tuck's work has been particularly helpful for me to explore the consequences of disciplines that are divested of their troubled history. She argues that neutral frameworks are flawed in their approach and their analysis of underserved communities because they do not account for the historic sociocultural and economic systems of inequality. By failing to problematize the underlying foundations of systemic marginalization, Tuck argues that the endpoint is always pathologizing and damage-centered analyses that are decontextualized and sanitized from the historical systems of oppression that have been left firmly intact. This serves to continually reinforce the white experience as normative and renders fields like LIS incapable of envisioning transformative modes of practice that account for race and privilege. There is a growing movement to decenter libraries as racially neutral and benevolent. These perspectives reject colorblindness and call attention to the organizing power of white narratives. Hanma contends that we have uncritically tethered ourselves to notions of universal knowledge that signify white modes of practice and thought as a legitimate and appropriate way. It serves to reinforce whiteness and leaves us again unable to envision transformative practices. Others like Hudson rest their critique on diversity as a principal strategy to address racism. Although it may appear that diversity would be the appropriate response, severing the ability to critically engage with racism structurally is emphatically not an anti-racist strategy. To be anti-racist, the dialogue must center and problematize race, power, and privilege. And most importantly, it must include meaningful action to redress racist power structures. Thus, diversity alone is faulty because it asserts that inclusion is tantamount to equality. As Espinal, Sutherland, and Rowe further highlight, the common library responses of forming committees or writing policies and other documents are ineffective and haphazard. Not only do these responses institutionalize human suffering, they're also frequently abandoned as internal priority and public attention change. Most crucially, institutional responses that lack community engagement and a redistribution of decision-making and power are in effect largely performative acts as opposed to, again, transformative change. Critical diversity theorist Sarah Ahmed's work provides an interesting insight into the performance of diversity and inclusivity in institutional settings. She describes institutionalization as a dynamic and fluid process of recession, whereby facts that are troubling become routine or ordinary and no longer present as problematic. The result being that dominant identities become normalized forms of oppression, which is to say that the tacit perpetuation of a particular kind of body and a space becomes normalized. We can poignantly see this process at work in our decades-long pursuit to diversify the field. Today, for example, almost 25 years after the American Library Association expressed its commitment to diversity and inclusivity in its ranks, very little, if anything, has changed. Rather, according to this data published in 2014, 87% of librarians still identify as white. On the other hand, the populations that we serve have steadily become more and more diverse. And so while the story of racial justice, both societally and in LIS, has been one of continual advancement, the truth is this has been a haphazard and often regressive pursuit. Much, if not all, position and policy statements throughout the field express the importance of diversity, inclusivity, and multiculturalism. This is but one of hundreds of examples, and we could find these throughout any library in Canada. This one states that Canadian libraries at national, provincial, and local levels affirm the values and benefits of multiculturalism by responding to the complex needs of a diverse population. By reflecting and supporting cultural and linguistic diversity, libraries play an important role in preserving the identity and values of multicultural communities while recognizing their contributions to Canadian culture. But it is not insignificant that the library workforce still remains predominantly white, nor is it insignificant that we have little relationship or resemblance to the populations we serve. Rather, these are strikingly clear signs that we are not the equitable profession that we profess. While we hold tight to the idea that we are inclusive and diverse, we fail to acknowledge that libraries are racial and majoritarian spaces that replicate oppression. Ahmed's point is interesting here, because she notes that within this uncritical dynamic, diversity can only achieve minor gains that are performance or representative of multiculturalism within expressly white power structures. The performative result being non-binding and largely celebratory statements with little action. In the past example, the undefined library community makes a series of commitments, yet it makes no mention of the causal roots of systemic inequity, nor does it acknowledge that these goals are untenable in an operational framework of neutrality. For Ahmed, statements such as this and similar diversity narratives are just a floating signifier that represents a desire to appear diverse and are largely meaningless to those affected. Well, the goal is to enact change. The goal, is not to enact change in the institution or its functions. Rather, Ahmed says it's the opposite. Although they are drafted to imply an actionable desire to foster diversity, its main function is to signify to others that diversity has been taken seriously, that inclusivity and multiculturalism are valued. However, she says that the only work often being done by the institution is to have drafted a policy. Almost condescendingly, she points out that there must be a further step. You must do something with it for it to have meaning. She argues that commitments to diversity have become a signpost of having done something when nothing was done at all. The other interesting aspect I find of Ahmed's critique is her point around projection and correction. She notes that diversity statements principally aim to correct or create a new image. So when we say that we affirm the value and benefit of multiculturalism by responding to the needs of a complex or diverse needs of it, responding to the complex needs of a diverse population, we are not saying that libraries ought to be more diverse or that we currently underserve some. We are correcting the perception that libraries are not diverse. And we are underscoring that we already respond in ways that benefit multicultural communities. Ahmed writes then that diversity becomes about changing the perception of whiteness rather than changing the whiteness of organizations. And so at this juncture, the library community faces important questions. One would call on us to lay to rest the idea that there can be neutral policies and ideas. For those beholding privilege, the idea of neutrality seems balanced and fair. Yet this overlooks that race is a key determinant of health, well-being, education, and life outcomes. Moreover, our failure to acknowledge and respond to a central facet of people's lives is a disservice at best and a powerful act of racism at worst. This is again especially true in the case of marginalized groups that are at the highest risk of being underserved and negatively impacted by our attempts to reign neutral in an unjust world. In his groundbreaking work, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Kendi argues that the guiding question for organizations and individuals is quite simple. Does the work, policy, or action account for different races and then work to redress unequal institutional power relationships? Or does it ignore or deny historical imbalance and thereby further contribute to systemic inequity, systemic racism? So Kendi argues that simply, in matters of injustice, there are no shades of gray. Our work is explicitly anti-racist, or it supports and further entrenches systemic racism. In the context of library work and values, anti-racism compels recognition that to be neutral or colorblind in racial injustice is to place oneself squarely on side with division and racism. Thus, Kendi's answer for how to be anti-racist is a twofold process. First, we recognize that the effects of racism are real and disentangle ourselves from faulty institutional notions like neutrality, diversity, and colorblindness. Then we take active measures to address policies on how we organize and undertake our work. Over the last 3 months, the world has seen a pronounced shift towards racial justice amid calls to address inequities that have been built in society and replicated by institutions like libraries. Police violence, criminalization, and disproportionate health impacts are highly visible effects, and responding to these instances are important first steps. They are exactly that, though, first steps. Policing and healthcare are not aberrations in an otherwise racially just society. Rather, anti-racism scholars have repeatedly underscored that racism permeates all parts of society and is supported by the collective working of social structures and institutions, of which librarianship has steadfastly argued that it is an essential part. Thus, in the context of our work, anti-racist praxis rejects the idea that the library is neutral and reimagines it as a just and inclusive space that acknowledges that we live and we work in a raced world. Whereas contemporary racial justice dialogue tends to focus on redistributing opportunities, anti-racism calls us to look at how we can support those most affected. For librarianship, this is an inflection moment that compels us to examine how our work supports racial injustice. We can do so by acknowledging the historical inequities in our profession, by disentangling ourselves from the notion that our work is neutral, reckoning with the ways in which race and white cultural normativity have informed our collective ideas about the library and who it aims to serve. We are anti-racist when we take real measures to replace systems of structural inequity, when we cease to merely respond to the causal effects of racial oppression and meaningfully focus our attention on institutional and systemic practices that allow them to perpetuate. Most importantly, anti-racism is a participatory and community-based process of reconciliation. It is based in practices of humility, understanding, and a sincere intent to do better. Practically speaking, this must include direct work to redress the real effects of the inattention and denial of race and racism has had on racialized people that use and work in libraries. We must examine and challenge library school curriculum to ensure the future library workforce knows about our history and its roots in fostering racist ideas and practices. We must stop falling back on false commitments to diversity and inclusivity and address hostile work environments where race and microaggressions are often minimized and ignored. We must meaningfully commit to begin filling the massive gap in our scholarship on the information, needs, and wants of racialized users, so we can better understand what social and cultural inclusion looks like to those that are not included. Finally, we must work collectively with communities to reduce racial inequity at the structural level. This is highly introspective work that is done internally to evaluate processes and practices that are contributing to societal oppression and identifying how it has entered our spaces and narratives. It is a justice-minded method that is focused on an express commitment to move past approaches found within institutions. Fundamentally, we cannot expect to address systemic racism from within the system that caused it, or without enacting and supporting those who suffer its ill effects. So within the confines of our current literature, we can conclude that our existing scholarship and theories are inadequate and do not account for the experience of racialized groups. We can also identify salient points that indicate that the historical response to race and LIS has been contradictory and paradoxical. The spirit of librarianship and social responsibility that I espouse is not necessarily a new or distinct change. Rather, it is reflective of the many of the principles that we state that we want to enshrine and protect. Anti-racist methodologies and perspectives are a valuable and an important tool to bridging the divide between theory and practice. They call attention to the schism between our policies and public-facing documents. They celebrate how the social and cultural aspects of diverse communities enrich our spaces, while we blindly ignore the contraindications of these principles in our work. In our field, in scholarship in general, it is not well known what information is suitable and supports anti-racist spaces and practices. But I will conclude by noting that this is an area where our field can significantly complement existing scholarship with evidence-based research on what information practices can support and contribute to moving forward with anti-racism measures. Exploring the potential of these areas of research will contribute to a growing and important body of scholarship that will be beneficial for scholars, libraries, and most importantly, our communities. This journey towards racial justice requires a steadfast commitment to listen to and to hear the feedback provided, to choose to see the opportunities presented, to learn about, reflect on, and grow our organizations to be more inclusive and reflective of the communities we serve. And although it affects each of our communities differently, libraries as institutions of public service do have a vitally important part to play in addressing racial inequity and creating a more just world. Thank you.
Thank you, Amber, for your presentation. We have about 6 minutes for questions. We can open up the chat. If you would like to write a question in the group chat, feel free. You can also unmute yourself. Looks like Sarah has a question there.
I do. I'm still formatting it, thinking about it. My own research, I think, really aligns well with yours. So I'm interested to hear you at the doctoral student workshop on the 2nd, and see what you think about what I'm writing about. But have you thought about, or do you think about the way that library and information science is so focused on the written word and concepts of literacy as like necessarily, or how focusing on literacy and privileging writing as a technology necessarily like minimizes like non-written cultures, languages, dialects, and codes that aren't considered to be standard or good language? And how do we kind of rectify that like inherent, I don't understand how to fix it. Do you have any ideas?
Wow, I've looked at other organizations. I don't necessarily know about, say, the focus on the written word. What I do know is that we've seen a pronounced shift in specifically my work in public libraries from, libraries as being kind of these holders of written works into community spaces, right? And so, Toronto Public Library, for example, has done amazing work engaging racialized youth by creating an open space that doesn't have, it has books, but it really doesn't need to have books. It just has, the doors are open and youth can come in and they can use the space how they want to use the space, right? And so it's not the typical library environment. And I think, I've been reading a lot of research around about kind of opening our ideas to an evolution in librarianship, again, back into our community values. And there's been some good research that I was reading about. It's not that different. We did this in the 70s when we got scared about computers, and so we've been able to to go through these evolutions. And so whether or not it's that we do finally accept that perhaps our beloved book is doesn't correlate well across all cultures, but I'm excited for your presentation. Thanks, Sarah.